over here, we have RS2, RS1. Once you make the choice of what kind of soil you want to take, then there are some locations that make more sense, that are no-brainers, that have low exposure potential. And so for the time being, I would call a less sensitive area. It's not in the GW1 area, so you're not concerned about the underlying groundwater being used as drinking water. It might be far away from neighborhoods, far away from wetlands. You know, it's the perfect location. It's not going to bother anybody. So you can imagine this in your mind. You have areas of less concern, and conversely, you can imagine that you have areas of more concern. You don't have much choice with some of these facilities, some of these holes in the ground. They're already there. So if you have a hole in the ground that happens to be in a zone 1 of a public water supply, it's there. And it's not like you can move it. So you're going to have facilities that are in more sensitive areas. They could be in a zone 1 of a public water supply. They could be, I don't know, you could be surrounded by old folks' homes, schools. You can imagine that there are more sensitive locations, and that in the big picture, grand scheme of things, the straw lines make a grid. Oops. In the middle. Less sensitive, more sensitive. RS2, RS1, RS0 soil. Where do you think DEP would put the most resources, have the most concern, want the most oversight, have the most controls? Which box?
Upper range. Upper range, highest concentration and most sensitive.
And you would be, Matt Hackman says, upper right. Upper right, all right.
Are we saying more sensitive?
Great. More sensitive locations where you have chosen to take RS2 soil. That would be the box, the combination of contamination, the combination of uncontaminated soil and sensitive location that, we would want to make sure, if that is your proposal, we would want to make sure that you know what you're doing and that you can do it, and there are controls in place to make sure that, as the statute tells us to do, that those operations do not pose a significant risk. And that would be the goal in the permitting process, to make sure sufficient controls are in place to do that you know the soil is coming in appropriately, that everybody could look at the operations and say, yes, even though you're bringing this soil to that location, it's under control. There's not a risk being created. Conversely, somebody who has a hole in the ground that is in a less sensitive location, and they say, I'm just going to bring RS0 soil in, basically single soil. Ooh, we died. Then that is the area where you would have less concern. It's in the types of, not that we wouldn't want to be assured that what you're doing is safe and effective, and that you'd really want to be sure that you're bringing in this kind of material. We know you're here, but we want to make sure that this stuff is coming in and not there. So obviously there would have to be standard operating procedures, there would have to be controls, there would have to be sampling protocols, but our level of comfort with that would be a lot easier. Right? So that's the broad picture, and then there's stuff in between, right? So we'll put this up on the web. You can see, you can draw pictures like this, where the closer you are up to there, the more, I'm not sure stringent is exactly the word, but the more it would look like a typical permitted facility for us. Maybe that's the way to do it. And the more you're down here, the more it might look like a conditional exemption. That maybe you don't even have to come in and tell us about it, But you should keep records, you should manage the site appropriately with some standard practices, and keep the documentation so you know what's going on. Yes, Matthew.
Again, not to get too far into details, but are you broadly considering, as you said, locations are what they are in the receiving, but are you considering the possibility that people could make modifications to the location to reduce the level of concern about sensitivity? Various geotechnical, let us say, modifications that would make it less of a concern for sensitive receptors. Without being disposal.
Blew my mind. Well, let me start off before I answer the question. Kind of how I would take the first cut at what would be kind of sensitive receptors, and again trying to make sensitive locations, not receptors. Trying to make use of what we already have out there and what people are familiar with. My first cut, and this is personally, and this is not the proposal and all of those caveats. This is going from the big picture to slightly more, and the deeper we get into the details, the more likely the details are to change. So don't hold us to this. But the less sensitive thing, my first cut would be, again, reusing what we already have. Look at the criteria for what constitutes an RCS1 location. We already break, for the MCP for notification purposes, we break up the world into more sensitive, less sensitive locations. The more, this is probably the way to do it, the more sensitive location is a location that's above a GW1 groundwater. Right? A more sensitive location is a location that's close to residential areas, to schools, to parks. I think that's about it. Daycares, yeah, daycare schools. So it's well defined, people are familiar with it, people are comfortable using those, they know what those terms are. So why not build off of that? Make sure that, maybe throw in there wetlands, make sure that if you're close to wetlands, it would fall into more sensitive, maybe a handful of other things. But using the RC's criteria for that. So given that, and here I am answering your question, given if that were what we were to do, then short of changing the groundwater category, short of buying out the houses or the school that's in the neighborhood, no, I would not envision that, but there are those possibilities.
There are those possibilities.
But given that kind of criteria, but keep in mind that even in these more sensitive locations, what we're not saying is that you can't bring this material there. Because again, underlying fact of all of this is we're talking about uncontaminated material. But they do have more or less concentration material in it, and there are some that you want to be a little bit more careful with and have to pay more attention to. So if you're in this area, if your location happens to be in a location that is more sensitive, you actually have a choice, I think. And this is one of the kind of business decisions that I don't have to make, but I want you to have a choice in order to make those decisions, is do you want to bring RS2 material? It will be clear the type of permit and the kind of operating expectations that we would have if you were going to bring that material in, versus bringing in RS1 or RS0, where our concern would be less, and that would be reflected in the nature or type of permit, or absence of permit. So that's the broad thinking, and you could draw circles and things, and say there's discussion, whether, say you have 4 circles where you have some exemptions, conditional exemptions, a couple presumptive approval or general permits. I'm not a permit person, so I mess up the language a lot. general permits where you don't have to wait for approval, it's permit by rule, and then, the far extreme would be where you come in and get an operating permit like we would for a lot of our other programs. And that in general, I think, is how we would see this. Now, whether we need 2 categories here or 1 category, we'll see. It depends on what fine-tuning we have. I think in general, a lot of the operating principles will be the same. We don't want people to create dust. We don't want people to create exposure. We want you to know what's coming in. So there are some baseline things that are going on. Some of the differences might be, in some of them, we may want the sampling data, the information about shipments coming in, as they come into you as operators, similar to our bills of lading under 21E, submitted online, people can view it online, so there's that transparency. There are other situations where you have a conditional exemption from a permit. We recommend that you keep the documentation. You don't have to, maybe don't have to send it to us, but you should have it because someday somebody complains, you want to have documentation that you're meeting all the requirements. And then in between, you might have things where it's an annual summary report rather than the day-to-day operating reports coming in. So, those are variabilities, but the differences that, I would say that we could incorporate into the different types of permits reflecting kind of our level of concern and our level of comfort with what's going on. Again, very broad strokes. Thoughts or comments?
It's Rick. Maybe if I could walk up to the board, which would be a first.
Sure.
One quick thought, Paul. I hate to be a nag. Say if we have, and I'm going to use another color for this, but say if we have in our CS1 receiving facility, RS1 receiving facility, we have a commercial development, parking lots. We have a lot of urban type full soils with pHs to meet demand, some of which exceed our CS1. And they're exempt from reporting. It's, parking lot, whatever, commercial development. We want to take in some soils for some infrastructure development in that particular parcel that are similar in quality to the soils that are there, but because they exceed our CS1, we can't do it. That's kind of what I was getting to before.
Because of their generating location.
Yes.
Again, I'm thinking off the top of my head here, and this is not a commitment, I love having these recorded. I can caveat it and have it recorded. But I think if it was one of these projects, and you were in one of these categories that you have a permit, for example, then having the permit and having this large project, the way that we're viewing it is that we're not bound by the RCs per se, and if you think about what I've said, you have more sensitive locations under certain conditions can take RS2 with a certain permit. So I think what you described, where a location needs fill and is operating under one of these permits, depending upon the type of material you want to bring in and its location would dictate what type of permit you would need. And if you had that permit, then you would be allowed to take that material.
But it would be remediation waste under what he described.
I'm caveating that I just described a situation where a certain location would be able to take certain material under certain conditions. I'm not really answering his question about whether his particular project, with X, Y, and Z. It's just we We have a,
Yeah, we're getting a comment that the live feed is out.
Again,
Should be all right. Do you see it? That's from before.
no, here.
It says 250, so.
It says recording, but the stream button.
Okay.
We're still learning how to do this.
First time.
There.
There we go. They'll be happy now.
Give it about 15 seconds and we'll come back. But that's great. That's good that somebody used that. That was a comment coming in? Excellent. Tell them type back thank you. Oh, actually, they'll hear
No,
me
they'll
now.
hear you.
Thank you
Maybe.
for comments. We'll get better at this as time goes on.
we hope.
So now we've changed the subject completely. Anybody else have any questions as we move along? Okay? This is good. You like this concept?
Yes.
Not that you're committing to anything, and you can tell. But I mean that's generally the way that we're viewing it. Okay. So I have a question. No, I have a question first. So, and this is just my own amusement. If I told you that we're considering calling these permits type A, B, and C, which you think you know what I'm going to ask? Which one would be the type A?
Yeah, exactly.
Would it be this one or that one? I want a show of hands. How many people would think that?
ABC.
If we have type A, B, and C permits, which is the A, let's say A, B, C, that's no permit. Would a permit be the one of least concern, or the most concern?
Least.
Show of hands, and Paul, if you could sweep the room. Okay. Let's do most concern. Type A would be the permit of most concern. We'll count these later off the film. Okay, so the rest of you, and you should raise your hands just so that we can count it later. Type A would be the permit of least concern. All right. Thank you, that's very useful.
No consensus.
Absolutely.
And this has been a raging discussion.
I figure if that's the level of disagreement that we have, then we'll do it.
A1.
Oh! Just like A1 Okay.
Yeah, he's skiing.
Yeah.
He's black
I think Andrew was going to see. I had Andrew or somebody from Boston Environmental.
Go ahead, John Cole. So could a permit actually have RS2, RS1, and RS0 soils identified in it?
Sure. Yes.
All in one permit?
Yes. I think that.
I think the answer is yes. I think it's going to depend.
I just wanted to make sure.
Yeah, I think that people need, the people who are going to be in charge of the filling projects
that's better.
need to identify what they're going to take in. And if it's in a more sensitive location, you can probably envision that we're going to have a lot stricter requirements in the upper right-hand corner over there than we would for the material with lower levels of oil or hazardous materials. But I would think actually that the facility is going to need to identify what you're planning to take in,
In your soil management.
and then tell us how you're going to manage it. So now Andrew does want to say something.
But is that, I think what we're asking is, say a facility has some fill areas within 500 feet of a house, but there are others that aren't. We're using the old lexicon. Some areas of the site are, would be classified as RCS1, some would be classified as RCS2. Could you come in with a proposal and say, okay, well, this location, we're thinking not yet, RS2, and some RS1.
And we may try to change the initials just for the sake of confusion. I think what you, just to spin this out, and again, thinking off the top of my head, if that's what you want to do, it's all at one facility. What you would be needing to demonstrate to us in your proposal is what procedures are you going to have in place to make sure the stuff that should only go to the less sensitive area only gets to that location, and how you're going to sort of what walls are conceptual walls, not real walls probably, you're going to have there. So, and I think that's something that we're just going to have to look at. I think at this point, you know, there certainly are quarries. There are lots of sand and gravel pits in potentially productive aquifers, GW1 areas, the areas that are being actively used for drinking water right now. And there are, we don't want to, through this, tell people you can never fill them. But I think what we want to do is make people think really carefully about what you're going to bring in to fill them with, and how you're going to have appropriate controls over that. And there may frankly be some holes where you're going to, the private sector is going to decide it's not worth the hassle of having to be so careful. That, and the way you can manage that is take in the less impacted material. Okay, John again, and then see who else has questions.
So what happens to the civil soils policy? Does it get thrown out for anything over 100,000 yards?
This is a 21E question.
Yeah, the civil soils policy, and more importantly, the civil soil regulations at 310 CMR 40.032 parentheses 3 very specifically talks about what, where the soil can go without DEP approval. All of these are DEP approvals. So I would view it as complementary. You know, this is going to specify when you need DEP approval. If you're doing this and that, it's going to need DEP approval. There's one thing we haven't talked about here, and I'm loath to bring it up because we've already talked about it a little bit, is the volume. You know, one of the wild cards in this, or variables, not wild card, in this is volume. For the interim policy, you know, we've said 100,000 cubic yards. Okay. Here, you could imagine, or I certainly imagine personally, that there would be volume cutoffs, and I would throw out there that the volume, depending upon which box you're in, the volume the de minimis volume, or the point at which the need for a permit kicks in, might differ. So you view this box as being permit exemption, for example. You know, the one step up, the things that get the type A or C permit, depending on your half full or half empty point of view, are the de minimis criteria, the level at which you would need to have the volume where you would kick in, where you would need to have that permit, might be different than a type B permit or a type C permit. So those de minimis volumes, those areas where you're not required to have a permit, is one place where the civil soils policy would certainly continue to thrive, because that would describe one way in which people could move soil without DEP oversight. I think it will be complementary. I think it will be more obvious when everything is said and done.
But your requirements will be more stringent than the civil soils policy.
You're reading a lot more into this than
Oh, no.
we'll see. I mean, the civil soils policy.
No VOCs and no PCs.
The civil soils policy is based on very specific regulations. So we'll see. Depends on what you have. Okay.
Other questions about the general approach?
The general approach. Another thing that we haven't talked about is, imagine if you will, when I say quarry, I mean quarry, sand pit, gravel pit, or any large project being used to prepare a site for development, etc. It's just shorthand. So if you own or operate a quarry, or thinking of buying a quarry in order to own and operate it, it's not that we're picking on you, it's just a convenient shorthand. But one of the things the Section 277 does tell us to consider the future use of the property, and to make sure that we, into the future, we have no significant risk. So one of the things that we're thinking about is, as part, which would be part and parcel of the operating permit, depending upon what you have, is, if you're going to fill it with stuff, and you're taking it up to RS2 soil, for example, there is a benefit to using the RS2 material deeper in the quarry and having the material that's up at the top to have lower levels of oil and hazardous material. And at some point, you could see there are situations and filling schemes where we may be interested or may be requiring having an activity and use limitation on it, but also if some thought is given to layering and, for example, filling most of the quarry with RS2 material, that's just an example, but then using the less OHM, I'm trying to avoid the word contaminated, soil, the RS1 or RS0 soil in the top layer, then we could see situations where that would not require an activity use limitation, even though you might have the RS2 material down there. We're still working that out, but that's the general thinking, that looking at what might be the final reclamation plan for, or final use plan for this, the final grades, et cetera, some consideration in this, in the layering, could eliminate the need for an explicit activity use limitation in the future.
Jeanine Comer from Haley and Aldrich. So, to step back one point, because I'm still confused. If you had a, using the old terminology, RCS1 location that was in a sensitive location, like ozone, and you want to bring in RS2 soil, is that something that DEP might consider?
Is it something that DEP would consider? So this, to restate the question, if you're, for example, if you're in a more sensitive location, which in MCP terms would be RCS1, but you want to take in, for whatever reason, RS2 soil, and that's a proposal that you come to DEP with, would DEP consider that?
Well, not just consider it, but actually approve it.
I'm doing this one step at a time. Would DEP consider it? Yes, DEP would consider it on its merits. Would DEP approve it? I don't know. I haven't seen your proposal yet. And we would have a lot of concern. Are we saying that we would absolutely rule it out right at the start? No. I think there are situations, materials, etc., that it might make sense to do that, but you need, make the permit application, think it through. And it eventually would be a business decision if it is worth the hassle and the controls that DEP is going to require in order to give us our sense of comfort that it will be safe and protected and pose no significant risk. And you can make that determination.
We have a question from the web.
Oh, question from the web.
The question from the web.
No, wait.
Okay, the question from the web is, please consider not burying soils of high organic matter. We don't want to create sinkholes.
And then we have another question.
Okay, that was a comment.
Yes, that was a comment.
You have another question.
Another question is, can the quarry be lined to accept soils with higher concentrations?
We are not anticipating that these facilities would go down that route. First and foremost is we are viewing this not as a soil disposal issue. Quite frankly, you have soils that have, that are contaminated soils, that are concentrations higher than this, and they need to be disposed of, you find a disposal facility. We're viewing this as from the perspective of the reclamation of soils and trying to answer the question of what kind of soils are useful to be reused and used as fill material in order to reclaim quarries, in order to promote, prepare properties for development. It's the, without using the loaded term, it's, what is clean fill and how can it be used?